Welcome to DIYeasycrafts and Berg Knifemaking.com. Today we're going to take a look at how to easily make hybrid knife scales or knife handles. These particular knife scales were made from scrap pieces that I had in the shop. This is burlap, micarta, and ironwood. And I put some black and red spacers in between the two. So hybrid scales is not something that I do often. I'm certainly not an expert at it. This is just the way I do it. I start off on a flat surface with parchment paper. These are basically the two pieces and the spacers that I've cut. So I've got ironwood, I've got burlap micarta. I use the chop saw and I cut a 15-degree angle on both of those pieces, and they're both cut a little bit oversized. I'm using CA glue, and I'm going to glue each piece individually together and hold it firmly together for about 30 seconds, and then move on to gluing the next piece. You probably could glue all of them together. It's just not the way that I've done it before. So after a 30 count, now the first black spacer is attached to the ironwood. I'll glue the other side of that spacer and then glue the red spacer to it. And again, I'm going to hold that for a 30 count. And I'm just going to repeat that process. I'll glue the red spacer to the black spacer, and then I'll glue the black spacer to the burlap micarta, or the biggest piece. And each time, firmly holding them together for about 30 seconds. The CA glue sets up really nicely in 30 seconds, but you really have to give it a good hour to fully cure. Now, once all of the pieces are together, and they do lift off the parchment paper fairly easily, I put a little bit extra CA glue in each one of the joints. Not really sure if that's necessary or not, just a precaution. Once it's dry, now take a real good look. My pieces are all uneven. That ironwood is thicker than the burlap micarta. The spacer material that I've used is cut oversized. I just went to the 2x72 grinder with a 60 grit paper. My grinder's a OBM, Origin Blade Maker. It's a 2 horsepower variable speed. And I just trying to flatten both sides so that I have a good flat surface to glue. I'm going to actually put a black liner onto this. And also evening out the front, or the surface that's going to show. And now you get kind of an advanced look at what the finished product is going to look like. And I think it's actually going to come out pretty nice. Now, when working with hybrid scales, you always have to make sure that you're going to line up the spacers, the top and the bottom of the spacers, when you're drilling your holes for the knife. Because you could have beautiful knife handle or knife scale material, but if you don't mount them to the knife correctly and those spacers are off, it's really going to be visually obvious. So it doesn't really matter how you mount these scales. However you normally do it would be fine. You could pin these and glue them with epoxy. What I'm doing on this particular blade is using removable scale hardware. It's a threaded spacer and then cap screws. So for the process that I'm using, I'm going to lay out with a black magic marker basically where I want the scales to be. I'm leaving them oversized. They're oversized all around. I will bring the profile in once the holes are drilled, and actually once they're mounted to the blade. The first step, as I mentioned, I wanted to put liners on. I'm going to glue, again with CA glue, both of these scales to black liner material. And this is a vulcanized liner material. I think I got this from USA Knife Maker. Once the liner glue is hardened, I'll trim off the excess liner material just on a bandsaw. And then I'll clamp my blade exactly where I want it on the one set of handles, one handle side, and drill one hole. This is a 1/4" drill. Once that one hole is drilled, I'm going to pin those together. So because I'm using removable hardware, I'm going to use the threaded insert as my pin. So you'll see it in a second. When I take my hand away, that front hole already has a pin or a threaded insert in place that holds it in position while I'm drilling the second hole. Now what I do is I transfer those holes from one scale to the other. I clamp them both together and drill through one into the other. The final step, because I'm using the removable hardware, is I'm going to counterbore each one of those holes so that the cap screw will be recessed. When doing this, I set the depth on the drill press so that I can't drill completely through. I also make sure that I clamp that material. You know, the tendency is just to hold it, but especially with the burlap, I found that drill really wants to grab the burlap and lift it up. Anyway, after the holes are drilled, I pin everything together. So now I've got both scales pinned together with the threaded inserts, and I'm going to start to form the front edge or the leading edge of the handles. And I'll run through, in this case, an 80 grit and a 120 and I think I went up to 800, and then I actually polished the front edge of those handles. Most times you do want to polish the front edge before you mount them because it's really hard. You can't really do it, especially if you're gluing them into position. Then I'm going to mount the scales to the blade, and I'm going to profile the scales right to the blade and finish profiling the blade at the same time. This guarantees a perfect fit. Now, whenever you're using removable scales, you really have to make sure that both the handle of the blade and the handle material are both very flat. And I'm just back on the 2x72 grinder, again with a 60 grit belt, rough profiling the handle material. And then I went to an 80, and I go vertical to finish it off with a 120. And you can see now that the liners are perfectly aligned on both sides. And the handle material has been profiled to fit the blade perfectly. Now I also use the 2x72 to do the majority of the shaping on the handle. So I round that upper edge with a 120 grit belt, very carefully, making sure that I don't touch the blade at all. And you're just going to end up with a nice rounded over surface. Try to make it even on both sides. Now I use a hand sander to do the inside curve, the inside edge, and I'll just round this over with an 80 grit and then a 220 grit. And then after that's all done, I'll hand sand. And I'll hand sand usually 500 and 1,000. And then I'll go back to the 2x72, this time with a felt belt and polishing compound. And I try to do all of the flats and as much as I can with this polishing belt. It just seems to polish faster and a little bit nicer than the buffing wheel does. But you always have to go to the buffing wheel to get, the hard-to spots, the hard-to-get-to spots. A little bit more buffing on the buffing wheel. And it's basically finished. The only other thing I did, again, because of the removable scales, I took everything apart and I cleaned out each one of those drill holes. It had gotten some compound in there, and I just cleaned them up, and then I reassembled it with new cap screws. So I have one set of cap screws that I kind of use on all my assemblies, and they get scruffed up and dirty. And then when I do the final assembly, I always use a new set of cap screws. So this is the finished product. This is hybrid scales, which is a combination of scrap piece of ironwood, a piece of burlap micarta, which was not quite big enough to make individual handles out of. I combined the two, incorporated black and red spacer material as well as a black liner, and ended up with some really nice knife handles. A couple additional images of the finished product. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and by all means, leave a comment. I'd like to invite you to join us on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making, and also to check out Jason Northgard and my book, which we put out last year, called Introduction to Knife Making. Thank you very much.